Welcome everyone to University of California, Berkeley. My name is Mark Richards. I'm the Executive Dean for the College of Letters and Science and the Dean for Mathematical and Physical Sciences. And I cannot tell you how pleased and honored we are to be hosting this amazing occasion this evening. We are hosting simultaneously the Peder Sather Symposium, which we do annually, and we have quite a lineup tonight for that. But we are also today, yesterday, tomorrow, celebrating the establishment of the Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study as a collaboration between a number of esteemed higher education institutions in Norway and the University of California, Berkeley. The Peder Sather Symposium, on the other hand, is sponsored by the governments of Norway and Sweden. All of this named, of course, in honor of Norwegian banker and immigrant Peder Sather, who immigrated to the United States at a young age, came to California, became a prominent banker, and was one of the founders of the University of California at Berkeley. Those of you who have passed through the gate, so to speak, of UC Berkeley literally may recall or know of Sather Gate, which I pass through daily. It's a beautiful monument and memorial to Peder Sather's legacy, and the Sather family also gave us the Campanile, from which we hear beautiful bells and music every day. So we're reminded on a daily basis of this legacy, but now we have a marvelous center with substantial support, thanks to our friends in Norway, to begin establishing a new set of deep intellectual collaborations in a variety of very strategic areas.
It is a great pleasure.
I'm sorry? I guess we had a little radio interference there. Maybe we're channeling Peder Sather tonight. Did anybody recognize the accent? I'm not quite sure. Okay. You know, that's my fault. I hit the button on the computer here and almost spoiled part of the fun tonight, but I think we'll figure that out. The Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study is the product of a great deal of effort on the part of many important people. I will not be able to mention them all here. It began, in fact, with our late John Jurdy, our Dean for Social Sciences, and many people involved, certainly Liv Dusner and Dusman. Liv, I'm sorry, but that's not an easy name for me to pronounce. Liv Dusen. And John McKee has been heavily involved in this, many other people whom you will hear about and meet tonight. But this has gone through several iterations over a matter of about a decade. But a number of years ago, Karin Sveen, I wanted to get that correct, Karin Sveen, one of Norway's most celebrated writers, published a book, Man from Montgomery Street, Mannen in Montgomery Street, which I believe was quite a popular and well-regarded book in Norway and is about to be published by the UC Press, translated into English. So I have an excuse, Karin, for not having read it yet, but we all look very much forward to doing so. This book ignited a renewed recognition of the role of Peder Sather in the founding of the University of California, Berkeley, and we are very pleased to have Karin here with us tonight as well, and she will be introduced later. The center itself, the Peder Sather Center, will emphasize over the course of its lifetime, of course, many different fields. Really, it will be a very fluid thing. Initially, we are looking, we already have nascent collaborations in the areas of energy and environment and education, human rights, immigration, social equality, and business competition policy, among others. And so these are kind of the kickoff fields. Many people here tonight are representing those collaborations already. We're having a series of workshops today and tomorrow to get this all going. This is all really quite exciting. But aside from kind of the business of the center, I think that there's a higher level of aspiration that needs to be said, which is that we are so honored here at the University of California to have such deep relationships with our friends in Sweden and in Norway, and particularly in Norway, to have such an amazing representation of your most esteemed institutions of higher education as part of this collaboration. And I don't think we should underestimate this. This is not just the University of California, this is not just California. I see this as our two nations, two great democracies, both representing important principles to the world, learning to work together in trust and friendship and in mutual interest, and that this is an example that will reach far beyond Berkeley and Norway for how peoples and scholars and students across oceans and across languages and across different ideas can come together and make the world a better place. So let's keep those aspirations in mind as we get on with the business of the center and get on with the symposium tonight. Now, I have mentioned Karin and her book, which was very instrumental in inspiring this evening. We are also very pleased to have a pair of folk musicians with us tonight from Norway. I expect you will recognize them from their costumes if they're maybe backstage now. I'm not sure if they're on with us yet. We have Knut and Ola Aastad Braten, who will be performing for us shortly. And they will be introduced by my boss, Vice Chancellor George Breslauer, in due time. But before that, we have a special insert to the program tonight, which is quite elaborate. We have a special direct from Norway via videotape, your Prime Minister from Norway, Jens Stoltenberg, with a special message for all of us.
Dear all, it is a great pleasure and a great honor to congratulate you on the opening of the Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study. The center will strengthen the academic relations between Norway and the US, and at the same time the center tells a story about the farmer's son from Norway who emigrated to the US 125 years ago, and now you establish a center in his name. That will strengthen the academic partnership, and it is important for research cooperation and an important contributor to the global knowledge production. In addition, I can remember that when I was a little child, I lived in San Francisco, and my mother studied at the UCB. I've been back to the UCB several times, and I've always been so impressed by the high standards, by the knowledge, by the research work you are doing at the university. So I really appreciate that we now can even further develop the ties and the cooperation with UCB. So I wish you all the best with the Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study, and I say congratulations from Norway.
So with that little interruption, let me reintroduce Knut and Ola Aastad Braten to perform for us this evening. Thank you.
The Peder Sather Center has one shorter history and one considerably longer. It reaches back to April 16th, 1860, when the university pioneers met at Founders Rock here at campus. At that historical meeting, Peder Sather was elected member of the Board of Trustees. Dear Sather descendants Katlin Brugger Andersen and Peder Sather Helle, dear audience, please join me in picturing Peder Sather by a few quotes from my archives. Daily Alta California, February 19th, 1864, quote, petition to the legislature of the state of California. The undersigned taxpayers of the city of San Francisco would respectfully ask that your honorable body will, by favorable legislation, enable the Board of Education to supply increased school accommodations. The fact that so many children are deprived of all means of education, not being able to obtain seats in the too overcrowded schools, and the further fact that many of these children are left to grow up in ignorance, induce us to make this petition, even though the granting of it should render an increase of taxation necessary. Peder Sather, Hubert Howe Bancroft, et others. San Francisco, 1867. Peder Sather in a letter to his brother Christopher in Norway. How is schooling in Odalen? I hope it is better than when I was there. In education lies the foundation of man's future circumstances. I have often regretted that I did not have the opportunity to come to knowledge when I was young. San Francisco Bulletin, June 19th, 1861. Miss Mary Emma Sather, Mr. Sather's daughter, was among the 4 students who graduated from the Young Ladies Seminary at Benicia yesterday. New York City Directory, 1832. Quote, Peder Sather, footman. New York Herald Tribune, 1873, quote, Peder Sather, banker, is at present one of the wealthiest in San Francisco. Samuel Merritt, Peder's friend, quote, a man who can get Mr. Sather's confidence can do almost everything with him. He will do things through friendship which is not in accord with the strict business principles. Eliza Teixeira, or Eliza Teixeira, a wife of an unemployed iron founder at Lower East Side, Manhattan, 1850, quote, any hint of our necessities, Mr. Sather gets on. Don't be backward in your speaking, he says. Oakland Tribune, December 1886, quote, John West Martin, regent of the UC Berkeley, is a very intimate friend of Mr. Sather's, having known him for more than 30 years. Peder Sather is known to every man and respected by all, he says. Rudolph Lapp, Blacks in the Gold Rush, 1977, quote, a Negro porter named Nelson Cook, who worked for Mr. Sather, the banker, was surprised to find that his wife and child had arrived from the East earlier than expected. Mr. Sather, recognizing Nelson's financial need, gave him $300. In the following years, an unusual black-white friendship was revealed. San Francisco, November 1872. Report of the Board of California Academy of Sciences, quote, Peder Sather and Leland Stanford were chosen lifetime members. Well, what would Peder Sather have told about himself if we could have asked him? Here is a hint, quoted from his first letter in 26 years to Christopher, his brother, quote, I want to write to you, although I have almost nothing to write about. Peder Sather loved music and was a close friend to the Norwegian violinist Ole Bull, who several times toured in America, performed in San Francisco, and visited Peder there. Listening to Ole Bull telling and playing brought Peder Sather back to his mother tongue and his father's farm, surrounded by silence, surrounded by melodies from his never-forgotten childhood.
De lekte gulltavl ved breden bord, I glede og lyst med alle. De fruer tvende med ære stor, så underlig legen mon falle. Til lykken vender seg ofte om. De terninger løper ofte omkring, de seg så snart måne vende. Så gjør og lykkens hjul ut I ring, dens løp man neppe kan kjenne. Til lykken vender seg ofte om. Og gulvet ganger det barn så vind, og lekte med vepler og blomme. Da innkom herr Aksel Toreds sønn, han akter til Rom at komme. Til lykken vender seg ofte om. På armen tok han den liten dokk, klappet henne ved viden kinde. Kristiva, du vart voksen nok, da blev du snart min mann vinde. Til lykken vender seg ofte om. Sa du la-la-la-la-la-la-no, sa-la-la-la-la-la-du-da, la-du-na-la-no, sa-lu-du-la, da-la-la-la-la-du-da, la-du-na-la-no, sa-lu-du-du-do. Så kom
Wasn't that wonderful? And thank you, Ms. Sveen, for bringing back images of the 19th century and the internationalism that helped in the founding of UC Berkeley. My name is George Breslauer. I'm Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost here at UC Berkeley, and I'm delighted to be serving as a host tonight. I bring you greetings from Chancellor Berdahl, who is currently traveling in Asia, or he would have been here tonight as well. On behalf of the entire UC Berkeley community, I'm really delighted to welcome all of you, and especially to welcome our special guests and colleagues who have traveled all the way from Norway to be here tonight. Thank you. You honor us with your presence. The Peder Sather Symposium has now for years been a forum for stimulating discussions of wide-ranging significance. It's brought to bear the insights of leading academics on a diverse set of timely and important topics of great interest to the UC Berkeley community. Just to give you a feel for what some of those topics were, it has touched upon the internationalization of higher education, touched upon global climate change, the contrast between the Nordic welfare system and the system in the United States, the influence of the digital media on arts and entertainment in the United States and Europe. So wide-ranging types of topics. And this year's lecture, dealing with international collaboration in scientific research, carries on this tradition with a special treat, an emphasis on the experiences and insights of two Nobel laureates very familiar with international scientific collaborations. I want to express appreciation to the sponsors of this event tonight, the Swedish and Norwegian governments, the Institute for International Studies at UC Berkeley, and the Osher Foundation and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I want to also thank tonight's sponsors for allowing the Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study to use the event, this event of the symposium, as a platform to publicly celebrate the inauguration of this center. I want to underscore how enthusiastic we are here at UC Berkeley about this new Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study and all that it will mean for increased academic collaboration between the US and Norway, and we hope someday, eventually, the rest of Scandinavia. In this connection, it is my honor to introduce our next speaker, the Swedish Minister for Gender Equality and Deputy Minister for Education, Ms. Nyamko Sabuni. Before introducing Ms. Sabuni, I want to introduce a personal note of relevance. My parents' families fled Nazi Germany, and my mother's family in 1933-34, and in the years thereafter as they sequentially got out of Nazi Germany, settled in Sweden, principally in Jönköping. And now that those who remain in the family are located in Stockholm. But at that time, my grandfather, my mother's father, who was born in 1886, was ahead of his time. He and my grandmother had 4 children, all of them daughters. And he said to all of his daughters as they were coming of age in the 1920s and 30s, you must all get education and professions so that you will never be dependent upon a man for a livelihood. Well, they got the education, they got the professions. One aunt of mine became the first female meteorologist in Sweden. Another became a high school teacher in Jönköping of foreign languages. A third became a medical doctor. And the fourth, my mother, became a social worker, which was very useful for handling my brother and me. So you can see why it's of special personal significance to me that I'm having the honor of introducing the Minister of Gender Equality and the Deputy Minister for Education in Sweden in the Swedish Ministry of Education and Research. Ms. Sabuni is a member of the Liberal Party in Sweden and also has a post on the party's board. In her current position, she is responsible for adult education, gender equality, non-governmental organizations, the financing of higher education, as well as the preschool system and youth policy. And I thought I had a big job. During her political career, Ms. Sabuni served in the Swedish Parliament for the Liberal Party, as well as the Minister for Integration and Gender Equality. Prior to entering politics, she studied media communication at Berg's School of Communication in Stockholm and studied law at Uppsala University. Ms. Sabuni was born in 1969. Didn't know they allowed us to introduce those details. In Bujumbura, Burundi. Minister Sabuni.
Thank you. My age was supposed to be a secret, but now it's out there. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here at Berkeley, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. I am particularly impressed by how Berkeley attracts the most talented scientists and researchers. People who come here to push the boundaries of science because they know it's possible. At Berkeley, new ideas are welcomed, not obstructed. And I'm sure that this is the main reason why Berkeley has several Nobel laureates, and we will shortly be listening to two of them. Professor Perlmutter and Professor Smoot, special welcome to you. In general, San Francisco seemed to be a place where people move to be able to act and think freely. Sweden has many advantages, but being open to people who think outside the box is not one of them. In fact, we even have an award for that national trait. It's called Jante, which could be translated as, don't think you're that special. I think Sweden needs a little less of Jante and a little more of Berkeley free thinking. As Deputy Minister for Education in the Swedish government, my ambition is that Sweden not only should be handing out Nobel Prizes, but receive some as well. In order to make this come true, Sweden needs to shift perspectives. We need to leave Jante behind us and invest extra in our most talented and outstanding researchers. We need to invest in frontier research to the same extent as you do here in Berkeley. We have noticed that young researchers often find it difficult to obtain long-term financing needed to build up independent research. Therefore, we now create a special program for those most talented young researchers. We also find it necessary to attract prominent foreign scientists. So special funding is allocated to increase the recruitment of top international researchers. Almost 4% of the Swedish GDP is invested in research and development, second to Israel. During this time of economic turmoil, we view it essential for Sweden's long-term prosperity and welfare to invest heavily in higher education and research. Over a period of 8 years, the government has increased state spending on research by 30%. So we have the money, and we're shifting the policy towards the most outstanding researchers. But one thing that still worries me is the absence of women in leading positions in the academic world. University and colleges need to reflect the society that they serve. It's not just a question of equal access, but of equal outcomes. More female PhDs, more female associate professors, more female professors, especially in science. Together, we need to find some answers why women's advances in primary and secondary education do not continue into the top position in colleges and universities. More women than men graduate college, but there is a stunning lack of women among professors. Among those who get a doctoral degree before the age of 30, 3 times as many men compared to women have become professors 12 years later. Any university that inspires to attract the best scientists must work systematically with gender equality. You cannot claim to attract the top talent if you are neglecting the female half of the population. This holds true for any organization, whether it is a major company or a university. And this is one of the things I hope to learn more about during my visit here at Berkeley and in San Francisco. And I'm curious and I'm optimistic. And I'm also glad to be here at the Peder Sather Symposium, an expression of the ongoing cooperation and strong bonds between California and the Nordic countries. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your inspiring words, Ms. Sabuni. We do like to feel like we have a reputation here at Berkeley for thinking out of the box, sometimes out of the universe, as you'll hear tonight. But I have to say that it's also inspiring to hear that your country and your countries are continuing and, in fact, increasing your investments in public education, because that's unfortunately is something that our state and our nation seem to be walking away from right now. So maybe a little bit of two-way here influence would be a very healthy thing. And certainly the striving of your country and our institutions for greater gender equity, especially in the sciences, is a project that is important to all of us and all of our future, and especially that of our daughters. So thank you very much for coming to speak to us. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you 3 people tonight, Saul Perlmutter, George Smoot, and Harry Kreisler, who will be participating in a panel discussion about the international nature of science. So let me begin by saying that we are very pleased with the Swedish Royal Academy and their selections over the years. On average, about every 4 or 5 years, you see fit to award a Nobel Prize to a Berkeley faculty member, and we are very pleased to have 2 of them here tonight. Saul Perlmutter won the Nobel Prize last year in 2011. When Saul was growing up, he wasn't necessarily thinking about looking through telescopes, but he was playing his violin, and he was thinking about big questions like, will the universe last forever, and where is the universe anyway, and stuff like that. And he came to Berkeley as a graduate student and has spent a good bit of his career both in our physics department and at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And in the 1980s, he began to realize that telescopes were in fact useful, and he might be able to use them to understand the history of the universe, in fact, the expansion history of the universe. In a nutshell, and I won't spoil his show, the discovery was that instead of gravity slowing down the expansion of the universe, something else was increasing the expansion rate of the universe. That something else is now called dark energy because we really don't know what it is. But it does comprise about 3/4 of the mass energy budget of the known universe. And so, you know, that's quite a feather to have in your cap, having discovered 3/4 of the known universe. There were actually, Saul will always be generous to tell you that there were 2 teams that almost simultaneously announced this amazing discovery, and both teams were involved in winning the Nobel Prize. And both teams had roots here in Berkeley as well as elsewhere, and I'm sure we'll hear about that aspect of things. George Smoot came to Berkeley in 1970 with a PhD from MIT, and he was on the staff, he was postdoc, I believe, on the staff at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, and now, of course, professor, and now professor emeritus here at Berkeley. George was inspired at some point by then the relatively new discovery of what we know as the cosmic microwave background, which is basically the thermal remnant of the early explosion or the Big Bang. And George and his colleagues recognized early on that it would be possible to build instruments that might detect minute variations in this background and effectively map the shape of the early universe, which of course could be compared to the shape in terms of galaxies and clusters of galaxies and so forth that we observe now, which ultimately is a test of the theory of inflation and the theory of what happened at that 1/32 of a second and at the initiation of our known universe. So we have one of our Nobel laureates who has discovered the nature of the origin of the universe, and the other who has discovered or is in the process of discovering its fate. So we're going to hear more about that tonight, and we're very pleased to have both of you here. Harry Kreisler is the executive director of the UC Berkeley Institute for International Studies. He administers a number of interdisciplinary academic and public affairs programs that deal with global issues, and he is a famous interviewer of interesting personalities and chronicler of the histories of those people, especially here at Berkeley, and has a nationally broadcast interview program. So I'm going to ask Harry and George and Saul to come up and find these comfortable chairs, and Harry will take over the conversation from here. Gentlemen.
Welcome, gentlemen. I thought I would begin by asking you to help us understand how your work builds on the insights of your predecessors and frames the questions of inquiry for future scientists in your field. George, we'll begin with you.
That's an easy task. Because when I started, the idea of studying the universe was more speculation than observation, but we did have some hard evidence. We had Hubble's, discovered the universe was expanding. We had Gamow and colleagues predicting how the elements came and arguing with Hoyle about that. We had some information that told us rudimentary things about the universe, but we had competing models, particularly what became known as the Big Bang model and the steady state theory. And while I was a student, the cosmic microwave background, the relic radiation which we now know as the relic radiation from the Big Bang, was discovered. And that inspired me. I said, oh, of course, that's the right answer. And then people say, wait, you're jumping to conclusions. Real scientists do it and test it. So I spent a lot of my life first proving this radiation is the relic radiation for the Big Bang, but at the same time, trying to develop as a tool. And as Dean Richards said, we first use it to make a map of the embryo universe, but we're also able to use it as a tool to find out what the universe was made out, what are the basic fluids that it's made out of and how it's developing over time. And we separate the issues of what is the structure of space and time itself from what are the structures that form inside the universe and eventually become galaxies and clusters of galaxies and so forth. And then that's where Saul's work takes over and tells us about the future.
Saul.
So my work it's kind of interesting that the idea that you could actually determine the fate of the universe by looking back into the history of the past to find out what it was doing and then seeing whether it was slowing enough to someday come to a halt and perhaps collapse. That idea actually goes back to right after Hubble first saw that the universe was expanding, because people started immediately wondering whether gravity would be slowing it down. And in fact, the idea of using exploding stars, supernova, to make that measurement was already suggested within just a few years. In about 1932, there's already a paper suggesting that you might be able to use exploding stars to make this measurement of the history of the expansion. However, for the next, 50, 60 years, we didn't we didn't know that there was a kind of supernova that could be used as a standard candle that was all the same brightness that would tell you how far away they were. And that wasn't until the mid-'80s, just about when just a few years after I started working on supernova, it was discovered that there was a subtype of supernova that could be used for that purpose. So that sort of kicked off this whole program. There's also a technology aspect that we, at just about that time, had developed the CCD detectors. Not we, but the community. And these are the detectors that we all now have in the back of our digital cameras, but they were at that time a revelation in terms of the technology. And put on the back of a telescope, they provided a way of making a much more detailed measurement than ever been made before. Those two ingredients of the past led to it being very simple to do the project that we ended up using to measure this surprise that we thought would tell us how much the universe was slowing down, and instead told us that the universe was speeding up. And of course, your question about where does it lead to in the future, it's pretty clear that now we have a mystery. The fact that we're calling it dark energy, as was stated, just reflects dark because we're ignorant of it. That's not its color. And so we now have a big, a huge project in front of us, which is to try to determine what most of the universe may be made out of, which sounds good.
So part of our heritage here, we didn't say, but it's in the back of everyone's mind, it's Einstein. And he was one of my heroes when I was growing up, and now he's been influencing my life ever since in a much more direct way, because he invented relativity and the general theory of relativity, which gave us a framework in which to try and understand the universe in a serious mathematical way. And where the things we're seeing are things that challenge general relativity, that either it's right and we have these other amazing things going on, or it's wrong. Either way, it's a big discovery. So when you talk about, what the future is, it's going forward and either learning that something is different about gravity that we don't understand and that we have to, improve upon Einstein's work, just like he did on Newton, or that we actually have these really new things in the universe that we have to deal with. And so they show up in this period we call inflation period, when we have accelerating expansion. They show up in the dark matter, and they show up in the acceleration dark energy at the end of the, at the present epoch.
So in solving a puzzle, you open the door to the further search to the solution of other puzzles.
Right, so this is our theory of ignorance, right? As you expand your volume of knowledge, the surface is what you're ignorant about, because you don't know what's beyond even that, right? So it's we're proud to say we expanded the ignorance of the world.
In what way did international collaboration enter into your work?
I think all these stories are ones of international collaboration. My project began relatively international from the very first few years. We already had postdocs and visitors coming to Berkeley, and what would happen is that as they came and got the project started with us, they would then return to their home countries, including, by the way, Sweden, and then build a research group there that would continue to collaborate with us. So we would then, every year, we'd be doing our collaboration meetings in, alternating different countries where we would go. And of course, it led to great meals and some great science. So.
Let me say a little about it, because in fact, it's in my history, I've seen the increased internationalization of science in an amazing way. And so even in the early days when we were first trying to see, is this really like radiation, we had an international collaboration with Italians and also with Haverford College, East Coast College you don't hear about. But the interesting thing is the professor from there actually took some of our equipment to Tromsø, Norway, to make a measurement. Why would anyone go to Tromsø? Well, because it's cold and dark, and you can make observations there. It turns out wherever you want to make astronomical observations is where you don't want to be as a person, and because you want to be high and dry and without air and stuff like that, and so forth. So that was the beginning of it, and then we did this series of 3 satellites, and as we've gotten to the last satellite, which it's going on right now, and we're getting ready to report results from the Planck satellite, it's more Europeans than Americans involved in it, although there's a strong contingent both ways. And we even have a set of Nordic people involved in it, and from including Finland, right? And it's very common now for that to go on. And if we get back to talking about women and so forth, one of the places I collaborate with now is Ewha Women's University, which happens to have the largest women's science and engineering departments in the world. So there's some learning to do from this experience. But there's a collaboration that's an international collaboration that also involves the Russians and many other people at this time, right?
You suggested that this collaboration is evolving, and you're watching it change. Can either of you identify the way that collaboration is changing? In an earlier era, people would come to Berkeley to study, but is that being diffused now?
I would say, I'm sure George would agree that right now, actually, it's a period in which the centrality of the United States to these collaborations is no longer quite as important. And so now a lot of these collaborations are much more equally balanced between various countries than they were in the earlier days of the work. A lot of it is good news, right? A lot of it is because of exactly the kind of investment that we were hearing about earlier in Europe, in particular, and also in China and Japan and then Korea. But some of it is actually for some disappointing reasons that I think the United States is somewhat disinvesting compared to where it was back when we were beginning the project. So there's there's good and bad news in that story. Of course, there is this other aspect of international collaboration in science, which is just that science has always been such an international language. I mean, it's like music, where the people who are involved in it have never cared much about the boundaries, and that's one of the reasons why scientists have often provided some of the better means for diplomacy during periods in which the countries themselves at the top levels couldn't talk. The scientists were always talking.
One of the perks, I think, that goes with being a Nobel laureate is you really see the world. I learned this from George sitting across from him yesterday at dinner. So I'm curious, what sort of innovations are you seeing in international collaboration that might not directly relate with your work?
Well, just a couple things, but let me say a little bit more about your last question, which is, over the 40 years I've been in Berkeley, I've had a tremendous number of students and postdocs. And of course, Berkeley cares about the Berkeley grad students, but I've been taking graduate students from other countries, particularly historically, a lot from Italy, France, and Germany over the time period. And they've gone back, but also Spanish, and occasionally, right now we have a person from Holland here, a person from England here, and a person from Korea here, right? But over the time period, the throughput has been quite substantial because I had a fairly large experimental group. And so I had a continuing flow of people through here. And so you know, as a scientist, most people are aware of the fact that they had a series of students and they've gone on to other institutions in the United States. Here, it's very clear they've gone on to other things. And Saul sees that in the supernova group, that some of his fiercest competitors were once people that worked with him, right, in the same place. That is a part of the internationalization going on. It's good as long as you're cooperating and competing together in other sense. But what I've seen in other countries is tremendous varied response. And there are places where the United States or other places think they're very far ahead. And surprisingly, you find out there's a pocket of excellent people somewhere that have made a tremendous advance. And so I deal with people in Grenoble. Today I found a group in an obscure part of Russia that's learning how to do phosphor tampering of gallium arsenide to solve a problem, to make it work. And they're working with Siemens in Germany now and Daisy to try and get this into a form that's commercialized. No longer is the technology concentrated in a few high power centers. It's possible now for it to be quite spread. And what's really very scary from my viewpoint for the future of what's going on, I would say more than 80% of the PhD students in science and engineering are from East Asia. And that's just going to change the balance in a stunning way. And it's a question of whether they're learning the culture of science quickly enough and well enough to keep science progressing and keep it open so that we have the free flow of information around the world. That's what I think has powered the economic development of the world so tremendously in recent years, is the fact that researchers make these discoveries and they collaborate and they make these discoveries and the knowledge is freely accessible. If I'm sitting in an African village that has internet, I can download the human genome. I mean, it's what makes the discoveries go forward at a fast rate.
Do you have any comments on innovations that you've seen as part of your Nobel travels that really, wow, they're really doing something here that we're not doing in our subfield?
Well, I guess there's technical innovations, of course, that you see. You can easily find, in most of the advanced countries where you think it's amazing how varied the approaches have been, and that you'll find some little pocket of an amazing results coming out of someplace where you hadn't realized there was even going on. But I think also innovations in how to organize, science are constantly being tried, and I think it'll be very interesting to see, for example, how the various attempts at using the larger European community are going to come out. I've seen a few varieties of them tried out so far. I think so far they haven't hit a perfect formula yet, but at least they're getting the conversation going in Europe. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens when they find something that just takes off.
There's one thing that's really noticeable that's going on. There's an incredible number of places in the world where people are trying to recreate the environment of Silicon Valley. That is the mixture of the education, the research, the talent, the venture capital, and so forth. And that works when the economy is really good. The way it's been since 2008, there's many of the places that are stumbling quite along. And you see people making these huge investments with the core research, the spin-off companies, the high-tech companies, and so forth. And some places that's working, but only when the economy is going up. And so it's very noticeable in China that you're seeing this stuff in an incredible way. There are pockets of it in Korea. There are places like that in Japan. And people all around the world are copying what they see are good formulas. And the Bay Area is one of the places that's taken as a great formula. The Bay Area has survived a couple of downturns, which is quite remarkable. It's reinvented itself. And so there's some more secret ingredients that are here. But it's the thing that's also become clear to everyone is there's a tremendous shortage of talent. And the thing that you see over and over again now is the worldwide competition for talent. And time after time, Africa is being stripped of its most talented people because there's no good future for them, for jobs in Africa. But there are people in the Middle East or in Europe that are willing to pay them, reasonable and give them a career path. And that works great. And that's what's needed in those countries. But you have a problem about how you make sure the rest of the country develops. And it's even a problem, we were talking last night about the NGOs. Looking at the Rector, he was saying one of the problems is the NGOs come in and they immediately hire some of the few talented people there in order to solve a short-term crisis, and they slow the long-term development. And so the issue, and the issue that we'll get back to later, is the importance of education and bringing talent, including the women, into it, is there's a tremendous need in the modern world for science and engineering talent and well-educated people to do it.
Let's talk about the women's issue, which the minister so ably brought to the agenda of our meeting. And so the question is, are you seeing more and more women in your classrooms and in your labs, and how has that changed over time?
See, I mean, it's an interesting question, because I'd say it's been very difficult for us. I mean, I'm looking at physics, for example, at Berkeley over the years. I think there's been a concerted effort to try, and the change happens on the order of one faculty member or two faculty members at a time. It's a very difficult process to see built up. I've been on the admissions committees for graduate students, and you see that it's very difficult there as well to get the numbers that you need to change the story that we've been hearing about. On the just the personal experience side, I mean, I'd say that I've definitely noticed the difference between a research group that has some women in it and a research group that doesn't. It feels to me like it's always seemed like a much more healthy, productive group when there's been a bit more of a mix in the room. And I imagine that would be the case if we had a few other of the less represented groups as well, which we just don't at all in many of the sciences. So it's clear that it's something that we need, and it's not clear still on what the right recipe is to get there.
Do we have to start earlier? I mean, do we need to go back to K through 12? Is something happening there that's discouraging women?
Yeah, we're losing everybody in the K through 12, not just the women. We're losing the men out of this kind of stuff. So there's a general recruitment there, but actually we're losing the women more at the break to grad school and the break to professors. And that's really clear. If you look at the undergraduate in physics enrollment, for example, because I know that in more detail, it's between 30 and 40% graduates. But when you look and see what fraction comes to graduate school, it's much less. And it's a funny thing, it's a condensate. So I spent 5 or 6 years as chair of the recruiting committee for graduate students for the physics department. And I developed the plan, and it was fortunate we happened to have 2 women in a row as department chairs, because that actually helped, because they came in to give the welcoming speaks, because we have this tour of graduate students that go around. And we set up a lot of things in order to make that more systematized, and I brought in the young professors and researchers and always made sure to have somebody like Alexandra, we had some new young professor. And the fact that, and involved some of the already existing women grad students in it, because the women students had to feel that it was a place where a woman could do well. Seeing a woman chair, seeing that there were other women grad students who said they were succeeding very well was a very big thing. And it was a condensate kind of thing, because all the students are now going around, all the potential grad students are going around together to visiting in the various universities. And they get through each other's email, they talk to each other, and they say, this place looks like a place a woman could be doing okay. Until we saw the fractional acceptance by women go up in Berkeley substantially over that time period. And we'll see how that pans out over time. But there's a lot of environmental and other issues that you don't normally think about when you're saying you're trying to encourage it, that you have to do. And even simple things like, well, what if I get married and have a child or whatever? There's these complications that the men just usually gloss over. I mean, we have some postdocs and some grad students who have children, families, right? Saul has a woman graduate student who just had a baby. That's a non-trivial load to be having as a woman to go through the situation.
I was going to say, very specifically in this particular case, I know that the student who I was talking to just yesterday is now seriously considering not going on in an academic world, mostly because of the issues of raising children. And I'm remembering the comparison to my Swedish colleagues, where both my colleague who's male and his wife were both getting paternity and maternity leave, and both taking it. And I don't know whether that's been enough to help in Sweden, but it certainly sounds like a little bit more of a step than we have here.
To shift focus here in reading about your research and understanding it as much as I could, the one thing as somebody who studies government and politics, it was very clear that of the role of government in supporting big science.
Can I say a couple more words about the women and then?
Sure, please, go ahead.
Right,
yes.
So, because I have an experience, and by coincidence or by real circumstance, Saul's wife Laura studies EY University, EY Women's University, and so forth. But when I went there to first teach my class, and when I taught my class, a class there last spring, you walk into the class, and there are 25 women and 2 men, okay? You never see that in a class anywhere here, and it's a very different kind of feeling, and there's such a cultural difference too. It's hard to understand the distinctions there, but you know, we have an opportunity here to see from her studies and from our experience what goes on there. But there's 3 different classes of people. There's a lot of, you know, there's sort of the finishing school aspect, there's the arts and literature kind of side of the place, and there's the engineering and science side of the place. And you can see them. I mean, there's an incredible number of women coming in high heels, but there are the women that look like nerds, right? And they are nerds, and they're perfectly happy with that. And Koreans are happy to be nerds, and they look that, even when they're doing Gangnam style, they're nerdy, and you know, it's quite a normal thing for women to be doing science and to be that kind of activity. So I think there's a cultural aspect that people aren't quite used to, the fact that there could be women nerds. It's just, you know, not.
So let's go back to the question of big science and the role of government. And, you know, we're in an age where it's the politicians are universally accepting austerity, and austerity now, not, you know, in the future. What is the consequence? Because in reading about your research, I mean, we're talking satellites, airplanes, and all sorts of things that really made your research possible.
I mean, I'll mention 2 aspects of it, and I think George will have others as well. There's one aspect which I think is very clear at a place like Berkeley, where we have a very direct connection to government funding in the form of a national laboratory. And there, it allows a certain kind of freedom to do longer-term, larger projects that you wouldn't otherwise consider doing if all you were working on was a 2-3 year funding cycle. So for a good example was, in fact, my research that you heard about today, where we thought it was going to be a very difficult project. It would take us 3 years. 3 years along, we still hadn't found our very first supernova to use for this measurement. 6 years in, we had figured out how to do the project. 9 years in, we actually had collected the data, and 10 years in, we had analyzed the data. And in almost any other funding model, none of this would have happened. You would have said, well, you had your chance, you did your 3 years, you're done. And yet, I think none of us felt like it was a waste of those 10 years to have spent this time getting this result. And I think many really big, important, interesting problems, be they scientific or societal, are problems that take a number of tries. You don't get it right the first try. You keep working on it, you keep iterating until you get a result. And science really requires that kind of longer-term strategy. So that's one side of the story that I think is very clear when you ask about government funding. But I think there's another aspect which I think you're picking up on, which is I think this aspect that the return on this kind of money spent is really the return on investment. It's not and I think much of the problem with the austerity budgets that we're hearing about has to do with the lack of recognition that a lot of money spent has to do with investment into the future, and that you don't necessarily want to be sopping up the money from all sectors all the time just because you're worrying about a budget deficit. You have to be thinking about how do you structure things such that you've invested in what's going to happen later. If you cut out all of your investments, then of course it's the equivalent of eating up all your seed corn, and you can't expect much of a future out of that strategy. And I think that's a real danger with how we've approached science funding at times.
Right. I actually think in the current climate, Saul wouldn't have been have the 10 years. It's the days there is in the federal government usually 2 or 3 kinds of funding. One is you pick certain areas either to get a block funding to, or just invest in good people and review them and make sure they're making progress and you fund them. There's the part where you have these, like the NSF, where you have these grants that are 2 or 3 years, and or NASA, where you get money for projects. And the situation is going that this investing in good people, that line is drying up and becoming more and more micromanaged, and that is going to be, it's going to be very more difficult to really try and do long-term projects. And I've been thinking since I got the Nobel Prize that I'm trying to push long-term projects because other people can't be in the position to push them along the way. But it's a failure for people to understand, this is a problem which for most developed countries is, I think it's endemic, because developing countries understand education and research and science and engineering are critical to their economic long-term development, and they're investing in it, and they're trying to catch up with the advanced countries. The advanced countries are taking it for granted, and they're leveling off, just assuming that they're going to be ahead of everybody for whatever it is. I'm impressed that the minister from Sweden is understanding that different. I hark back to some history. One of the things that impressed me very much when I first went to Nordic country long ago, we had a conference in Copenhagen, and for an outing, I went with the person, one of the people who co-discovered the cosmic background radiation to begin with, that is Wilson. And we went out to the island of Sveen. It sounds like heaven, right? And it turns out the island and all its output, which was 2% of Denmark, was given to Tycho Brahe to study the heavens. So I was impressed. Here's science getting 2% of the GDP, right? You just top that. But the only place that I had ever seen it where people had built that as a plan were places that had no resources. Unlike, well, Norway has many resources, Sweden has a few less, but it has resources. That was Singapore, where they made a decision that they had to invest in research and development. But it's not just research, it's research and development, and it's comparable fraction of that. And the countries that are doing that are the ones that are both well-governed and are doing well. So I don't know if it's the government or the vision or the whatever it is, but a lot of the prosperity in the world, I think, came from the fact that there was preparation to World War II. Prior to World War II, research went way up. And the United States was a research growth engine for much of the development of science and technology in the world, and everyone benefited from it. And now Europe is contributing in a major way, but you're seeing the rest of the world begin to contribute in a major way.
So you're identifying two things here that I want to bring out. One is this is really an important aspect of America's relative decline, on the one hand. And on the other hand, a positive note here might be that it's going to push us, if this austerity continues, to greater international collaboration, hitching a ride on a European plane, so to speak, for a study. Is that a fair analysis, or?
It's already happened.
Yeah.
It's too late to say it's going to happen. Okay. It's already in the way. And in fact, I am trying to start a new initiative in Berkeley, and we spent some time reviewing it, and we said we have to go back, produce a white paper, and go back to the Department of Energy and say, look, here's a critical technology for nanotechnology and health for the future, and the United States is falling behind in this area because you guys are afraid to invest in it during this time period where the budgets are so uncertain, and you're falling behind these places, these different places in Europe primarily, but in a number of other countries. And these are critical to the well-being of the country, both in terms of health and in terms of financial kinds of activities. And you're seeding the technology, which is the next generation technology you need. Right now, we have many countries have that. When I was in Jordan 3 weeks ago, visiting a light source that they're building, and there are these advanced light sources for doing, essentially molecular biology, protein analysis, stuff like that, material science, all this kind of stuff, because we're in the age where we're going to talk about manipulating individual atoms and molecules. In order to know where they are, you identify them with X-rays. Now the advanced light sources are soft X-rays, but you're going to move into the slightly harder X-rays where you can measure the position to an angstrom, and you can identify the elements, and you want to see the whole structure. We don't have the detector technology to do that quite yet. We can produce them, but we don't have that. People in CERN and DAISY and various other, DAISY and Siemens together, they're making a major effort to develop that technology, because that's where the new generation of great discoveries are going to come. Not great discoveries in terms of the universe is expanding, but discoveries in terms of how do we make new tools that are going to be great for medicine, that are going to be great for whatever it is. And that's a place where we're behind already. I mean, we're 2-3 years behind the people in Europe. So it's not just there, but one of the reasons I'm spending a lot of time in Europe right now is we're doing the Planck satellite. We had to do it through the European Space Agency because NASA wasn't up to making the next generation satellite at the time, because they're busy with the next generation space telescope and can't afford more than one. Right?
When I think of a Nobel laureate, I think of that moment of creativity, aha, the discovery. And I want to ask you about creativity and how you think it's nurtured for a future generation. And I have a second part to the question, which is when one talks about American decline, when I've interviewed Nobel laureates and other scientists, they say, well, we still have the edge on creativity. You know, that's where we can outdo East Asia because they believe too much in authority and so on. So because our time is limited, can we combine these things? I mean, what is the creativity in the sciences, and is that going to keep us ahead?
First, I got to argue, I don't think it's good to say American decline, because America isn't really, the Americans are going more slowly, and they're not realizing other guys are coming up like that, right? And it's like Europe, parts of Europe are that way too. There are pieces of Europe that way. America is amazingly lead. If you look by capitalization at the top technology companies in the world, it's Google, Apple, whatever. There's only one non-American company in the top 10. That's Samsung. That's why the patent wars are the big deal, right? But the next one you get to is Siemens, and then you start getting into other countries, right? But so America is way in the lead, and it's been the fact that we've had this technology and science base, and we've been good about turning that into companies, right? And we were very worried that Japan was going to beat us, and Japan has the next in the next level. So we're not in decline. We're just in a kind of denial that we have to work hard to stay ahead, right? But you believe the guys in Apple are fighting and Google are fighting, and Microsoft is ruining the day that it fell down, right? It's because they'll soon drop out of the top 10.
Creativity. I mean, are we yeah.
I was just thinking about the fact that I mean, your question earlier, you're wondering whether or not being forced to join more collaborations will end up being a positive thing. And of course, it does work that way to some extent. But it does strike me that there's something about really coming to the table with something to offer, and as part of a leading part of a collaboration, that makes a big difference in terms of whose ideas get into the collaboration more strongly and more powerfully. And I think that actually affects science in a bigger sense, because science does depend a lot on having all of the different elements of what the different countries' cultures have to offer. And I think the American culture has actually something that's a little bit different in its style in doing science than you'll get in other cultures. I think you want all of them to be there in the room. And I have noticed that when you get to a point in which the US contribution to something is very minimal, those voices are not actually heard as much in the collaborations anymore.
And who's going to take the lead in this? Is it the kind of collaboration that we're seeing in the Peder Sather Center here, where there's a complementarity in terms of people coming together, and then the whole collaboration benefits?
Well, it will be interesting to see whether or not we get any models of funding that actually are a little bit more transcontinental, transnational in the broader sense. So far, they still have this little bit of a sense of, we're fighting to sort of get ahead versus, in a competition. And that does then lead to hearing one set of voices more than a different set of voices at a time. But it would be very interesting if we could end up having things like the center here and other such places really develop a more transnational view.
Well, our time is limited, and I've gotten the signal to end the discussion, but I want to thank you very much for this extraordinary opportunity.
I don't know whether the microphone is working. So we are going to take some questions, but the minister has another engagement, and so we need to send her on her way with Mrs. Osher. So if we can just take a little interlude for that, and then we do have some folks with microphones for questions, so we'll be taking those in just a second, okay? Thank you. Harris?
want me to take the, yes, okay. So if you have a question, raise your hand. And for the people from Berkeley, no speeches, just a question. Question, please. Do I see a hand? Oh, George, please.
If the goal of science is to generate if the goal of science is to generate knowledge for humanity, why does it matter if the United States, quote, falls behind relative to the lead it had in the past?
I think that was really the point that I was thinking about in this last discussion, which is that I think that just for the goal of getting better science, I think you want to have all the voices, playing a role. And I think right now we're tending to suppress, we're playing down this particular voice here. But I don't think it's it's necessary because you want the Americans to win in the fight for science, right? It's that you actually want science to win. And you want to have that style, which I think has been very good at bringing young people into the game, very good at entertaining new ideas. And you'd like to get some of that on the table with the same strength that it's had in the past.
Right. I would say it's not, whether America, you don't want to fight America to decline or not decline. You want America to keep growing. It is absolutely clear that the rest of the world is going to come up in a major way. Just do the PhD student count, and you can tell that there's no way that the lead isn't going to pass to other people. One of the things we didn't do, and I was saying that, America's still going up fast. Europe as a whole used to be bigger than the US, but didn't invest as much in research. It was living off some of the US research. It's now starting to invest some in research, but its economy hasn't been growing as fast. So both the United States and Europe as a whole are going to have diminished, influence in the world. And you're seeing a much more complicated multipolar world, and you're seeing countries you would not even have thought of. I was in Baku and Azerbaijan, and I went around to some different universities and gave talks, and there were big student bodies. It's very impressive what they're doing. And I met a bunch of grad students, and a lot of them were 40 years old. I mean, they're training people, for PhDs, and one of the guys gave me his book on quantum electrodynamics in Azure, okay? And so it is, you're facing a world where there's just a lot more, potential talent out there to be competing with you. And the question is, how are those all going to collaborate together? Because that country is not big enough to do major research on its own. It's going to have to collaborate with people. And so the issue becomes, if you want science to go forward for mankind, science always has a double edge. It can make individual human well-being better, but it doesn't mean it'll do it for all humankind. You need a way, you want to keep the culture where people are collaborating and they're making that knowledge available to everyone, not keeping it secret in their country and whatever it is. And you have a certain paranoia going on everywhere, including the United States now, where you're not allowed to talk to certain countries because they're worried that they're growing so fast economically, they'll threaten the United States, right?
Another question, please. Yes, please. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah.
Well, you could scream.
Yeah.
Hello. I have a question about the larger international events that drive science. So some people would say that science is sometimes driven by agendas of governments. Sometimes it's driven by consumer needs, and sometimes it's driven by, for example, back in the Cold War, driven by the competition between the two blocs. So I'm wondering, what do you see as the current or future broader? I mean, it doesn't mean that the government is asking scientists to find out certain things, but there are indirect mechanisms, for example, through grants, that they would drive the research agenda. So I wonder what do you guys think is the current broader agenda, or how does the international political climate change the agenda of science?
So I think historically there was a culture of science which the United States promoted very much, of being very open, very cooperative, and driven by trying to understand the way the world works, or understand biological system, whatever you want to consider as part of that world. But there has always been some, companies that want some development done. We usually call it research and development rather than pure basic scientific applied research. And so most countries have a basic research funding arm and an applied research funding arm and an industrial research. They do that. There's some military research often. There's always been a mixture of that. And the question is, what's the appropriate balance? And what is the relative long-term payoffs? And I usually give one of the examples of how you have to make, a knowledge increase over a broad area. And so suppose that I am Mr. Rontgen, and I come to you funding health agency, so you're the NIH, and I say, I'd like funding to research where the radioactivity comes from the sun. You say, no way, that has nothing to do with health. So he goes out, he gets a grant from some crazy person who gives it to him, and he goes out and discovers X-rays, and he takes a picture of his wife's hand, publishes a paper. The next month, there's an X-ray machine in the Berlin hospital, okay? There's no way in the world you could have thought that funding him to do research on the sun, right, was going to be a revolution in medicine, which means look inside of people without cutting them open, which was what people did before then, right? And now we have many tools for looking inside of people without cutting them open because of that, as a result of that discovery. So the most revolutionary discoveries come from places that have nothing to do with what you're trying to do, because everything else is incremental. So the creativity and the progress in science is in many forms. There's serendipity, where you discover how this works, and then it applies in a big way into another field. There is somebody like Einstein that has brilliant insights, but most of it is what I call herd intelligence, right? And so there's just all these people trying all this stuff and inventing this kind of stuff, and this is progress. It's like the army ants marching through the jungle eating the whole thing. Eventually, they do, or something like that. And so there's all different kind of levels, and so one of the things that happens in biology nowadays is there's a huge mass of researchers doing stuff, and there's some people who take big leaps out and find some new way of doing stuff, and then people come and fill in that area, right? It's like the scouts for the army ants to go and figure out what's going to happen. And it's the mixture of those, and so sometimes it's driven by personalities. Some people are, explorers and big risk takers, and some people are, let's chew on the frontier and solve this whole problem and go on. Science is not at all pure, but we used to at least have a culture that we're trying to understand it and share that knowledge with everyone, right?
Another question here? Yes, back there.
Since you were asked about the drivers for science, both of you are physicists who deal with questions regarding the universe. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about cosmology or philosophy in your science, or is that something you just bracket and you don't think about while you're doing your science?
Do you want me to take this first, or do you want to do it?
I'll just comment that I think one of the pleasures of going to a field like cosmology is that you get to go back and forth between what seemed like absolutely mind-boggling, only philosophical topics, and then just how are we going to fly these scientists to this telescope in time to get this observation, and then what are we going to build in time to get that data over here. So you're doing very practical things at the service of something that is impossibly abstract and philosophical. And I think you probably go into it because you like that bouncing back and forth, that tension between the two. Now, of course, there's I don't think any immediate, simple statements of, oh, now that we know that the universe is accelerating, how does that change our understanding of where we are in the universe? It's, these things are much more subtle. If anything, it's probably just the very fact that we can know that the universe is accelerating its expansion that changes our conception of where we stand in the universe more than the actual fact itself.
I forget what I was going to say. I have so many things to say about this, but the fact is, when I started out, I was interested in very many things, and one of the things I even thought about being was a doctor. That's why I talk about medical applications, and I'm thinking about building detectors now that would have implication for medical. But that's a long circuit, because it turned out my skills and my real deep interest turned out to be doing the math and doing the physics and getting there and see how things work on as fundamental level as I could. And part of that was doing particle physics, which I did my PhD in and my early work in. And then I realized the universe was also the same way, and I got involved in it because I wanted to know how things work and so forth. And I have a lot of questions. I think about it. And so I had this romantic idea when I went for the satellite launch where the control stuff was most near Paris. I thought, well, as long as it's going great, I can go to a cafe and think great thoughts. Right? So I still want to own a great thoughts cafe, and so in order to consider it and do it. However, the closest I got to it is I have an American grad student that I work with who's in the philosophy and history of science department, and we try and get together to have lunch once a week, and in the afternoon have tea and a chocolate dessert from the lovely bakery next door, and discuss. You know, he's asking me questions about, well, what do scientists think about this? He was trying to figure out when Kepler was doing his work, people didn't know about gravity. What was going to keep the planets going around the sun, right? I mean, you know, when you're the center of the universe, it's natural things go around you. But if you're not in the center of the universe, what keeps the planets going? You know, he asked these questions that are these deep questions. What were these guys thinking when they made up these incredible models, right? And that's exactly the kind of stuff that we're doing. We're making up models and we're doing these tests. What were we thinking? Were they reasonable models, or how much basis do we have? And those questions we come up with. So the answer is, yeah, we think about the philosophy of it and the implications of it. But a lot of times, you're right, Saul is right. You're just busy trying to get it done. And it's like, imagine now you're the doctor again, and you're a surgeon in the emergency surgeon, and the patients are coming in. You're dealing with a triage and life and death, and you're busy, and you realize one of them is your son, right? Do you stop and think about it's your son, or you just do your job, right? And the answer is yes, right? And so most of the time you're just doing your job. And then when you get great, you go, oh my God, it was my son, right? And I sliced them open, right? I could have used x-rays.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our panelists for this very informative discussion. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you all. We have one final speaker tonight, who is given the daunting challenge of doing a summation of what we've heard and perhaps some thoughts on how this may have some implications for the research agenda of the Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study. Rector Ole Peter Ottersen is the rector of the University of Oslo, where he earned his Doctor of Medicine degree. He is a distinguished researcher in the field of neurosciences. He became a professor in the Department of Anatomy in 1992 and held subsequently successively responsible positions until 2009, when he became the head of the Center for Molecular Biology and Neuroscience, one of Norway's centers of excellence. As rector of the University of Oslo, he and his team aim to make the institution into an internationally recognized university with a broad academic scope and wide-ranging strengths in all areas of research. And he has been a leading force in the establishing the collaboration that is now to be known here forward as the Peder Sather Center for Advanced Study. So, Ole Peter, the stage is yours.
Thank you. A daunting task, indeed, it is. To summarize in 5 minutes what has been told to us now, the start of the universe to the fate of the universe, summarized in 5 minutes. Well, that's something. So I dare say it's the most challenging task that I've had so far in my career. So thank you very much to the hosts. So let me begin with one of the issues that came up during this discussion, that is gender equality. It so happened that on my flight from Frankfurt to San Francisco, I came across a story in Financial Times. It was a fantastic story because it related to the rules that are about to be mandated in the European Union, that on the boards of listed companies there should be 40% women. Today in Europe, 13.7% of the board positions in listed companies are women. 10 years ago, Norway decided that there should be a quota, that 40% in our country, 40% of the board positions in government-owned companies and in listed companies should be women. Today, we are there. So what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to gender equality in science, it's very much a question about will, political will. We have to take measures, and we have to stand for them. And in that regard, I'm not exactly very proud of my own country, because we are still at about 25% when it comes to the proportion of women as professors in science. So we have a long way to go until we can tap the entire talent pool, as our minister from Sweden phrased it. So then, from gender equality to the other issue that was raised, and that is internationalization. And I think there is one story that I should convey to you, and that is my trip to Myanmar, Burma, this summer, because it told me everything, I think, about internationalization. I'll come back to that in a moment. The interesting thing, because there was a question about philosophers here, the interesting thing is that the term international, as far as I understand, was coined by a philosopher, the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, in his book that came out, I think, about the time of the French Revolution in 1789. And it's such an interesting thing to follow the development of the term international, because it's so different from the term global. Global means standardization, to look at the world as one unity, as one unit. International has this fantastic aspect to it, that it tells us that in contrast to global, international means that you should really appreciate the differences. You should really look at a problem from different angles, according to the place you're coming from. It is a question about diversity. And I think this is something that is forgotten about internationalization. The whole thing is simply to have a view, and now I'm using a new term. It's in the Urban Dictionary, maneuver. The view from maneuver. Thomas Nagel, another philosopher, wrote this book, The View from Nowhere. We can be detached in our approach to a problem, but also we can enjoy the fact that we look at the problem from different vantage points. I think this is one of the most important aspects to the term internationalization. And this also has to do, by the way, with gender equality. So what I experienced today when we had our discussions is exactly what is at the root of internationalization. We were discussing very diverse issues. We were discussing climate change, disruptive behavior in the classroom, pretty different issue. But it appeared to me that if we look at these issues from different angles, we can learn a lot. There might be synergies here that we can unleash in a very positive way. So back to Myanmar. This is exactly what I found in Myanmar. Some of the problems that we are confronted with today, most of them, in fact, be it climate or be it health, they are really global challenges that we cannot really fathom, we cannot really understand them unless we have this international view. In Myanmar, we were discussing health issues, for instance, diabetes. It's an epidemiological issue now, despite the fact that we have increased our understanding of how diabetes come about. The frequency, the prevalence of the disease is increasing tremendously, even in nations like Myanmar. To understand this health problem, You simply need to look at the problem from different angles, from different countries. You need internationalization. 2 words in addition about diabetes. 1 week ago, I handed out a prize to a Swedish scientist who had made seminal discoveries on diabetes. He made these discoveries in 1990, so our understanding of this disease is increasing tremendously. But at the same time, since 1990, as I said, the prevalence of the disease has increased. What is the aim of scientists? Well, yes, it's to make discoveries, to increase our understanding, but it's also our task to ensure that the knowledge that we are gathering and producing comes to the benefit of those that need this knowledge. So I think that one thing that we have missed when we discuss internationalization is that we need to be even more skilled at bringing knowledge to those that will profit from it. We need to bring knowledge about diabetes to countries like Myanmar, to Bangladesh, for instance, where they also have a very steep increase in diabetes. And then we also have to tackle the political issues that prevent this knowledge from being used properly. And this is the task of the commission that we discussed earlier today and that we are involved in the University of Oslo and Harvard and Lancet. How should we communicate knowledge to the different countries that need it, so that in the inequity, for instance, when it comes to health service systems, is being reduced, and that we can also exploit the knowledge that we have to reduce the prevalence of many common diseases like diabetes. I won't go on for longer now. I would just say that one of our first professors at the University of Oslo, he should have been here to couple everything together, because he had a fantastic motto, Et nos petimus astra. Also, we are reaching for the stars. So it speaks to the 2 Nobel laureates, Et nos petimus astra. What was the reason why this professor had this motto? He was an astronomer. Well, obviously because he was an astronomer, but also because he thought that the most important thing for a university is to have ambitions. And ambitions also when it comes to internationalization, because what he said and what he wrote was that science cannot thrive in isolation. You have to seek out international networks, and then you have to ensure that you get in contact with the environments that have the highest quality standards. This is exactly what we are trying to do today, to have environments meet, to learn from each other, and to accept the fact that quality is contagious. And we need to have the contagion spread. That's a very, very important thing for internationalization. So thank you very much for your attention.